In a weekend of unpredictable scorelines, we got one predictable sacking as Fabio Pecha has been given his marching orders by Parma, and that wasn't the only highlight. Welcome to the Anglo-Italian pod, and as you can hear, no Rory this week, but I am joined by my very good friend Andrea. Andrea, how are you doing, mate?
Yeah, all good. Pretty chill weekend, but not enjoying the results as much, but got through it in the end. How about you? How did you find your weekend?
Yeah, very similar vibes, I'd say. Very chilled, but enjoying game week 25. It's fair to say there was some interesting results in the grand scheme of things. And obviously, they're the main discussion points for today as well. So, listener and viewers, you'll be spoilt by the kind of array of talking points as we dive into the Derby d'Italia. What a feisty game that was, as Juventus won formidably in the end, but we will be talking about that. Alongside, obviously, Fabio Pecha being given his marching orders. It was only today, this morning, I was kind of speculating in terms of my notes, Andrea, whether Fabio Pecha stands a chance of, retaining his role. But he's been given his marching orders, and obviously I'll get you to dive into it later. We'll also talk about Fiorentina losing at home to Como. So, Andrea, I'm sure you'll be even more depressed after that announcement. But more importantly, we've obviously got Lazio holding on to a point against Napoli. Maybe they could have got all 3 points. And then obviously Atalanta potentially dropping points as they drew at home to Calgary. So anyway, we will join you after this break to discuss this and more. See you then. Cool. We'll start at 2:10. And we are back. And more importantly, we're going to talk about game week 25. And we start off with the Derby d'Italia, where Juventus won 1-0, courtesy of a goal from Chico Conceição. And Andrea, it was kind of I don't know how to describe this really, affair. It was maybe not the most aesthetic on the eye in terms of what we're normally accustomed when it comes to these two sides. But certainly from my point of view, we saw a different side to Juventus. But in the first half, arguably, we could have seen Inter dominating by at least 3 or 4 goals. What did you make, firstly, of the whole game itself? And we'll obviously dive into the kind of intricacies of the match, but how did you think it played out?
I just think it was a classic tale of two halves, really. You got
Mm,
the first half thinking Inter were dominating, they were going to go on to perhaps get that goal in the second half that they didn't get in the first half. But that second half, it just completely changed. It was like Juventus had this momentum from kickoff. They won like a free kick corner straight away, and then they were on it. And then throughout the rest of that second half, they dominated and deserved to win in the end. So it's, I think the question marks that kind of came from that game was just what happened to Inter more than fair
mm.
credit to Juventus. Because although it was impressive how they did it, it was just, again, another performance where Inter have gone missing. And I think that's quite a worry. It's not the first time this happened in recently as well. So basically a tale of two halves for sure. But yeah, a lot of question marks for Inter, and especially their strike force. Not again, we questioned about them not perhaps
Mm.
shining someone to get those goals that they've been lacking. And those two, Taremi and Martinez, weren't clinical enough when they should have been. So a lot of question marks for Inter for sure.
Definitely. And I think this is summed up by the stats that we saw for the kind of match. So if we split into the two halves, in the first half, Inter dominated the kind of possession stats and more importantly, the kind of XG stats. They had 13 shots in total. They just couldn't get one on target. But if you contrast that to the second half, despite them kind of retaining most of the possession stats, Juventus far more attacking minded. They went about it from the first whistle and, they got a lot more shots on target and they seems like they were fighting for the ball a lot more than Inter, especially at that moment when Colomwani gets that opportunity to break free and he has this mazy run through the box, which we thought maybe was going to draw a foul, but it landed at Chico Conceição and he manages to dispatch quite evidently. But I think the kind of key themes was, I think if we break it up into two halves, the first half was very much a case of Juventus probably paying far too much respect to Inter. Maybe they were cautious about Inter and what they could do. But it also kind of highlighted to me personally that Inter lack that kind of clinical edge that we've been used to. And we've kind of already drawn about it this season is the fact, that Inter haven't been able to make most of the opportunities that they do make. And that was summed up, as you say, by the likes of Lautaro and as well as Taremi, really wasting a lot of the opportunities. But also, there's one moment for me, Andrea, which I thought, right, this is the moment where Bastoni kind of breaks through and his pass was so wayward, it almost went out. It needed Denzel Dumfries to scramble right. I think that moment of play kind of summed it up for me. But there was a really good point made by Don Hutchinson in terms of the TNT co-coms summary, where he said, when Juventus had the opportunities, they kind of bombed as many players up top without kind of having that kind of build-up play, which reduced the opportunities for Juventus. And arguably, Andrea, I'd say Juventus, when they did break and they had, I think it was 2 chances in that first half for me that stood out, they could have made the most of it if they were a bit more clinical and had their shots on target, which inevitably, we still had Jan Sommer having to pull off an amazing save for one in particular, but it kept Inter in the game at that very moment. And it just felt very Interish in terms of the way that they've been playing this season. But in the second half, obviously, Juventus came with a lot more intent. What do you put it down to? Do you think it was the fact that maybe Motta read the kind of way that the game was going to be played wrong? Or do you think maybe the players were showing a bit of nerves for this game?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, and I think especially in that first half, I think I agree with you. It was looked like it was a lot of respect for Inter, worrying that they don't want to concede early, but it actually almost backfired, and they were a bit too rigid. I just think perhaps the second half, what got into them perhaps was the fact that Inter did miss all those chances, and the game was
Mm,
still in their hands to kind of claim. And I think with Inter missing the chances, it was an opportunity to express their play and try and challenge them for chances because they were going to leave spaces because they were going to push players forward. So there was opportunities to explore. And I think Motta identified the midfield as the key because we saw a lot of the ball and the game going through Thuram, especially midfield, dominating the midfield, breaking the game line. And the amount of times he did that,
mm,
I think was actually very key. And like you said, when they did get the ball forward, the build up play, they got players forward and it just made into question everything. They didn't know how to handle it. They were all over the place. And I
mm,
think it just caused confusion because in that first half, Juventus weren't doing that. They were a bit more rigid in their play. But by doing that, it just created a lot of questions. But also, when you're playing a team with 3 at the back, it pushes those wing backs back. And then when you do that, you play a team that's got 5 in defence. And that's when you're more vulnerable as a team with that 5 in defence. You're not going to get able to get out as much or out as quicker and stop those kind of counter attacks that Juventus had. So ultimately, I think Motta identified that midfield was the key. And we just saw again, Chanaloglu got subbed off quite
mm.
early on.
Yeah.
The Inter midfield, I think what I was quite surprised with when I was seeing that kind of turn of side that Juventus were dominating midfield, I was just thinking why he wasn't looking at someone like Fratesi to come on.
Mm,
I know he's not been always the ideal guy, but in that situation, he could have done what, Juventus had. He could have
yeah.
done it for Inter, kind of be that box to box, kind of that final run into the box, maybe grab a goal, grab a chance. So I just thought the substitutions as well by Inter, they were very lacking, but I think the key for Motta was that midfield. And again, Thuram, we've got to talk about absolutely incredible. But not just him, I think Vega as well. We've got a few
Yes.
players that Juventus had that were really good.
This was something I was going to allude to. Is actually there was a few standout performances from a Juventus point of view. Obviously, we saw Colomwani running the lines really superbly. I think he terrorized Inter every moment. Didn't give a moment's rest for the likes of Cherby, for example. But we also, like you say, Vega was really astutely kind of defending his lines alongside Gatti, who I thought was quite impressive in his duties. Di Gregorio also taking off a lot of the pressure, even in those kind of maybe unknown situations where he had to push the likes of DeMarco's efforts over the bar, and just making sure that it just went to simple things, rather than maybe a Chesney that might have tried to grab the ball or cause a calamitous moment. But certainly this seems like a much more mature kind of performance from the likes of the players. But in particular, you kind of highlighted Thuram. What a fantastic performance from him. And The one thing you alluded to in one of your TikToks was he's one of the best kind of midfielders right now in Serie A for sure. What do you think of this particular performance? Because I think he had to play a different kind of role to maybe what he's been accustomed to, right?
Yeah, definitely. I thought he was a lot deeper at the start of the game as well in terms of his positioning. But what I liked in that second half is that top quality players, they can take the game in their own hands and win it for you, and lead the
Mm,
line. I think he led that midfield like he was the captain, the main guy. He took on all the pressure of that game that Juventus were
yeah.
facing. Like it was a must-win game for both teams, but in particular for Juventus, they
Mm,
really needed to win that game to kind of get near that top four, fifth position again. So I think that's the key. I think the fact that he was able to have no fear, dominate, create chances, but also be consistent at it as well, and be the main guy they kind of led to in terms of the attacks in the end. Although Conceição had attacking flair, Gonzalez had a decent game as well. I felt like Turan, like if he wasn't there, this kind of result may have not happened. I think that's how crucial he was to this
mm,
result. Just the way he was. He was able to even break up play. Everything about his game was just absolutely incredible. And like, it gives me kind of that vibe. We talk about Ngisa for Napoli, how strong he is. Thuram is on that same level. Like, those performances are on that same level. I know it's a long way away because he needs to do this
yeah, sure.
consistently over the next years. But when you perform like that, you're up that level. It's incredible. And that's a game winning player in midfield you have. So it's exciting to see. And especially it's interesting as well that when they signed him, everyone was too focused on Douglas Luiz, but kind of didn't realize how
Yeah.
good Turan actually is. I was saying at the start of the I didn't think he'd be this good, but I knew he was a
No,
player there.
true.
But yeah, just it's incredible. And I think what I like as well is the fact that Coop Miners was going to be that guy, and it
Yeah.
hasn't worked for him. Douglas Luiz is going to be that guy, hasn't worked. So he's literally been the one that's like, right, I can be that guy. And I think that's what I appreciate the most about him. I think that's incredible.
And arguably, he kind of leaves a question mark for the likes of Locatelli as well, who, when he's come into the squad, he's actually looked quite good. And interestingly, you made a point about Cop Miners. I thought arguably that was his best game in a Juventus shirt. I mean, that's not by many stretch of imagination, something to baseline it from, but certainly from that point of view, that was one of his better games. Let's move on to Inter. Inzaghi having more than one mishap, it's fair to say. I don't know if that social media link is true, but certainly some AI artistry taking effect. If you haven't seen it, listener or viewers, there is a clip doing the rounds, it's fair to say, showing maybe that Inzaghi had a bit of mishap underneath him. Maybe his tailoring or his belly is getting a bit bigger these days. I don't know which one's the answer or the true answer, so to speak. But there's been some serious questions aimed at Inzaghi about the approach for this game. Obviously, we talked briefly about the selection as well. Where do you think it's going wrong right now? Because it seems to be not just one kind of aspect. It seems to be a culmination of different things. And I feel there's, these kind of maybe aims towards Inzaghi's maybe arrogance in terms of his style of play is starting to take an impact slightly on the way that Inter played this season. Arguably, they haven't got maybe the depth, and maybe some of these players have come to the end of their kind of natural pathway in some respects because, Cherby is still able to play, but I mean, he's what, 36, 37 now going into that kind of period, and you're thinking Inter need to evolve this squad. But it was evident by some of the performances on the night as well. Çalhanoğlu has not been the same type of player that he was a season ago, for example. Barella was still trying to pull all the strings, but he can't do it by himself. DiMarco was a shadow of himself. I think Nicolo Zalewski, when he came on, looks far better in that respect. But also, as you alluded to earlier in one of your points, Lautaro, I think he had about four chances and he completely screwed everything up, either rushed it or just didn't have that kind of calm composure that he normally has. Taremi, we've been kind of shouting about his credentials this season. I also felt in the early stages, actually, Pavard looks really shaky. It was one of his errors that caused one of the opportunities in the first half for Juventus. So it feels like it's across the board. It's not just one area. Now, I think that's the worry for Inter is that come the summer, regardless of what happens this season, they're going to have to reinvest in terms of this squad. There's already been a few rumours already going out about the fact that they're going to have to sell to maybe reinvest into this squad. The likes of Nico Paz from Coma's been linked, and we've also heard about the rumours around Castro from Bologna potentially being one of the targets. But I don't know if they're fundamentally ones that are going to help into the long term because they need something more instant. I mean, how do you read the situation right now with the squad?
I completely agree. It needs a whole reinvest. But the other issue is for Inter is that the players that they want to get rid of, players like Correa perhaps, some of the
Yeah,
midfielders, there's not much value in them. So again, if they're going to sell to buy, what money are
no.
they actually going to raise? And
Mm.
that's the big question of all. But I think when it comes to Inzaghi, I think he's been a bit unlucky with obviously maybe perhaps the transfer recruitment in recent years. However, I think his lack of plan B really starts to show in these type of games. Again, when you look at the
Mm.
substitutions, it's so predictable. Zalewski will come on,
Yeah.
Augusto will come on, and I think as opposing manager, it must be so predictable to predict, right, they're not going to change their system. So if we can keep our system and it's stopping them from scoring and creating chances, we should be fine. And I think that's what it shows. And then I think what sums it up is the fact that Correa comes on. Like this guy is like in the wilderness for like
Yeah.
9 months, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we'll give you a game because we need a goal. And it's just like, it's so the substitutions aren't working anymore. When you think of Inter back in the day, you've got Arnautovic quite recently that was coming on scoring. You had Palacio back in the day. You can even go back to Julio Cruz back in the day. Like they
Mm.
always had someone, attacking players would come on, score the goals, and contribute. But it just seems recently now that substitutions don't really help either. And then on top of that, what makes it worse is that you've got players like Chanaloglu, who we sang praises of, rightly so, because he was incredible in the last kind of year, beginning of the year. Even he's starting to fall off. So even these type of big players that have been leading the line for Inter, yes, they can go through these phases, which is absolutely fine. They're human, it happens. That's when you need to have the options on the bench and stuff to kind of, support it and try and kind of bring them back to their form again. And they just don't have that. So it's almost forcing the issue with these players that aren't performing. And then on top of that, not having the substitutions to be able to change the game, even tactically as well, just not being able to switch the formation to that extent. Taking Bastoni off Augusto is not really tactically
No.
changing real personnel. It's similar player. Augusto ends up playing left centre back. It doesn't really
Yeah.
change anything. So again, I think a lot of question marks come to Inzaghi, but certainly it's a big revamp they need because they are running thin. And if they do get over
Mm.
the line, it will be just because they've just edged it over a Napoli team who have similar issue as well. So it's going to be who can survive the most, really.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating scenario. So, whilst Juventus did manage to get themselves a result last night, Inter are still 2 points off Napoli as it currently stands in the standings right now, with a better goal difference compared to Napoli as well. But let's kind of do a final word on Simone Inzaghi because I do feel that maybe his tactics are getting a bit tired. I feel there's also a sense maybe that the players are getting a bit weary of these kind of same style of formats, keeping hold of possession, not really doing much what they would be sporadic at. They used to be so fluid with the style of football. Do you think Inzaghi needs to maybe kind of adapt to this squad and maybe make it easier for them? Because right now it seems like certain personnel within that squad have a more difficult task than they're used to. Plus the impacts of back-to-back games. They've got the Champions League, obviously they've got this, and potentially they've still got the Coppa Italia as well to play. And we'll see how far they go in that competition. But for now, obviously, it feels like there's a lot of demand on Inzaghi to get the results right now, but the form of the current squad isn't great. The next game is against Genoa, which you anticipate that they should be able to get a result. But the following week after, they've got Napoli, which is a massive game potentially for them. Where do you see this maybe changing for Inzaghi?
I think definitely it needs to be some sort of personnel change in the lineup because he's persistent with the same kind of 11, which clearly has its frailties. But I'd be interested to see certain players like Zalewski get more of a go because I feel like when he's come on,
Mm.
he's looked really impressive. Maybe looking at an opportunity where Zalewski plays and then DeMarco plays a bit ahead of him. Trying to like adapt a bit to get the best out of certain players because I feel like he's sticking to that kind of like identity of the 3-5-2, which works. But again, it's still like not elevating levels of players that they should be. And I think the only issue I have is that when you look at Inter's squad and the sub bench in particular, there's no wingers. There's nothing to
Mm,
change the formation to like a 4-3-3 or something. I guess Thuram could play it, but again, it's not the greatest option. So
mm,
they've set themselves up for this system. So there just needs to be a way where they could do perhaps maybe like a 4-3-1-2. Perhaps they could even switch to a 4, have a 3 in the middle and attacking mid. Um, I just think they've got to adapt their game. And there's a lot of games where they don't need three centre backs. When teams have got one striker, do you really need three centre backs? And I think that's another question mark I'd have. In this game, perhaps when the game was kind of fading out for them, why not go for that four back kind of option? It
mm.
seems like he still sticks to that three back, and I think that lack of adaptability is the worry. But if he can kind of adapt to that, certainly the quality is there on their day. So I just think he needs to adapt his tactics because right now, at the end of the day, I just think any opposing manager that faces Inzaghi is going to know what minute he's going to even do the subs. I feel like it's all predictable. Like it's all deja vu. It's like Zaleski will come on the 60th minute. Uh, Zielinski will come on with like 10 minutes to go to see if he can get.
Yeah.
It's so predictable, and I think when you become like that, that's where it becomes stale. And you're probably right as well. It probably affects the players as well, knowing that they're playing this style and it's clearly not working, and they're almost having to force kind of their levels up, and it's just that's where the issues arise. And I think that's where he needs to be more like, right, we need to address and adapt. But he hasn't done this in all this time. He's always stuck to the same thing because he thinks, I've won like this. This will work.
Mm,
But sometimes you need that change. We've seen it in the Premier League with Guardiola, for example. He's had to adapt. He's had to change.
yeah.
It doesn't matter what manager you are. You have to adapt at certain moments.
Well, that's certainly testing times for Inzaghi in his time at Inter. But anyway, we'll move on to first place Napoli, who returned to Rome for the second time in 3 weeks. This time they were playing Lazio, and sums up a bit from our co-host Rory when he erupted on Saturday evening with his WhatsApp message of Isak Son in capital letters. But what a hit it was after 6 minutes on the clock. What we would describe it as probably, Andrea, a thunder bastard, it's fair to say, because it was such an audacious effort from distance. But what a goal. He's been threatening this for a while. But in terms of the result itself, if we start off with that, finished 2-2. Napoli potentially a bit lucky to keep hold to a solitary point in the end, because I think Lazio in the end had an opportunity through Noslin in the kind of dying moments of the game itself. And I think even Marco Baroni kind of alluded to the fact that had it not been for the mistakes, and we'll go into them, sort of the details of those mistakes, that potentially they could have got away with 3 points in this match. And I think they were fully deserving of that as well, Andrea, on the balance of the game as it went out. But Napoli managed to get themselves a point in this. And Conte obviously alluded to the fact that he was proud of his players because obviously they've got another injury added to the mix. It was David Neres. Now he's out for a month, joins the likes of Spinazzola on the sidelines. It means that Conte is having to maybe change the dynamics of his tactics. We spoke about it offline, Andrea, and you actually felt that maybe the tactics helped Napoli and maybe a bit more fluid in terms of their style of play. But it was interesting also to see Raspadori back in the fold as well. And I thought he played quite well with Lukaku, but still the same form, unfortunately, Andrea. It's worrying times for Napoli fans, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, it's another game where, although they didn't deserve to win, they had the opportunity to hang on and they've lost it in the last kind of moments. We saw it against Roma quite recently as well. So I think what's disappointing is the fact that, again, it's not being clinical enough, not producing enough chances. And it's just that Conte typical win. It's like that one-off games, he thinks he can just come away and get the result, play a certain way and play a certain style, but it just doesn't always work. And again, they were very lucky in the end. Like as you said, absolutely, Lazio should have won this game. They'll take the point for sure, but there's a lot of question marks on certain positions. Again, Lukaku was a bit more supportive of Raspadori there, but again, it's Raspadori who's been left out a lot. So it's a lot of
Yeah.
like hit and misses at this point. It's not a reliable kind of front attack. And I still feel like a main issue for Napoli as well is that Lukaku's so isolated. Even with
Yeah.
Raspadori with him, I still like see him so isolated. not not getting the ball to his feet as often because that's
Mm,
his favourite thing. Ball behind, back behind goal, get the ball to his feet and let him turn. And I think they're not really doing it. They just rather stick it in the box and you'll get something. And I think
mm,
that type of approach needs to be looked at as well. And I think they've been too predictable sometimes in their play as well. But certainly for Conte and the kind of lineup and the tactical side of things, it's a lot of question marks again. And it kind of almost thins out the squad because when you look at it,
mm.
it's such a specific formation that like the wingers are kind of end up being wing backs. I think at one point in the game, Politano was playing left wing back. I mean, you're having a bit of a laugh at this point. Like, I don't know. There's so many question marks on the choices from Conte.
No, and I think the one positive to come out of this game was probably the return of Buongiorno in the centre defence role. He did allude to it in his press conference as well, the fact that he's been out for 2 months and it was a difficult game for him to come back into the fold, having to replace him with Politano. But yeah, I would say definitely from a balance of the game itself, Lazio definitely deserved to get more out of it. But, Andrea, it was all down to mistakes, unfortunately. Let's talk about the first one. Raspadori obviously scores 7 minutes after Isaacsen's crazy hit from distance. But it's another mistake from Ivan Provedal, who it's fair to say his form hasn't been great. He's been very sporadic with a lot of the way that he's been acting in goal these days. And it's a shadow of the Provedal that we've seen over the last 2 seasons. You know, he's been far more kind of calmer in those positions, but the manner of the goal, he kind of scuffs his kind of clearance and he had no pressure on him. But what do you think is causing him to have so many of these kind of issues at the moment? Because, you know, Marco Baroni spoke about it after the match. He spoke about the fact that he is going to back him despite these mistakes. But you know, these were errors that weren't really necessarily forced. And again, it's kind of costing Lazio because if they'd not had these kind of errors, potentially they got a few more points on board and potentially they'd be a little bit in a more, should we say, a better position than they currently are. I mean, it's still a very good place that they're currently in, but arguably they could be on a few more points than they currently have, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's quite surprising from such an experienced player at this point. He's been there for a while now in that number one posting goal. I just think perhaps obviously it's a confidence thing. Perhaps he's having the ball more to his feet than he normally would have had. He's using his kind of his passing from the back's kind of been more important with even with the Baroni as managers being a bit
Mm,
more into it. But it just seems to be more of a confidence thingy. And it's like you said, they've it's not the first kind of game. It's been quite a few games now. He's maybe stuck in mistakes, and it's a bit worrying. And again, I think what doesn't help perhaps Baroni is the fact that there isn't maybe someone as good to kind of come in and take his place in goal, kind of challenge him. And I think he has to stick with him in that sense. So perhaps it adds to the pressure as well that he's kind of got to stick with him in that sense. But again, it's another big game, which coincidentally you'd think he'd be more experienced to deal with, but it seems
yeah.
like composure, and it's quite telling as well when you've got games like this when you need to kind of win, um, and out of nowhere as well. That's the concern. It was not like it was
Mm.
pressured. It was a very simple thing, and yeah, it's definitely something confidence, I guess. But I don't know if maybe perhaps he doesn't feel confident with the defense in front of him. I don't know if the communication's not there. I don't know if you see something, but it just seems quite odd because he's such an experienced player.
Yeah, no, I can't work it out personally. I just don't know what's happened with Providal this season, but certainly the errors seem to be costing Lazio a lot more. But talking of errors, Maricic also scores an own goal, unfortunately. That was the most FIFA-like goal I've ever seen this year, potentially. I've not seen a more calamitous own goal. Having said that, hold that fire, you know, hold my beer almost, because there is a funnier one in the Bologna game. I'll definitely recommend viewers and listeners to check it out on YouTube. But before we go to Dia's equaliser, can I just say Zaccagni's scissor kick? Whoa, what an effort. How that was chalked off, it was incredible. But obviously, let's talk about Bula Di. Again, a player that we know about his credentials. Again, comes on. and he scores the equaliser and combines really well for his effort, doesn't he? He puts it past Merit, and arguably he had an opportunity just before then as well. That was superbly saved by Merit, but Buladiai deservedly getting a goal back for Lazio. Do you think with the forward line that Lazio have, do you think they could potentially claim a higher position as it currently stands with all the other teams and how they're playing right now?
Yeah, definitely. And I think they've all got goals in them, and I think that's quite key. A lot of teams rely on one guy to score the goals, and I think they've got someone that can score. Even Noslin that comes on can chip in more goals as well. But I think it'll be quite interesting to see because I think Tati Castellanos went off injured. I don't know how long he's out for. So perhaps Dia might get that kind of starting spree in the middle, which he hasn't really had. He's always been played out wide more because to allow Tati Castellanos to play in the middle. So if he gets a run of games through the middle, I reckon we could see some more goals from him and some more, important results for Lazio. So it'll be interesting to see, but certainly through the attacking third, they've got some goals, and Pedro again can come on out of nowhere and just produce something as well. He's literally ageless, that guy. He's incredible. So they've got a lot of options in that final third, definitely, and I think that's what's been key for their season and how well they've been doing is because they've had that in them. In previous years, they've obviously had a lot of goals through Immobile, but having lost him, you'd think they would kind of like come back from that kind of like goals to game ratio, but they've actually expanded their goals throughout the pitch, which is, I think, very crucial and very impressive. And it all comes down to the man as well. I think football he plays, it really suits the kind of culture that Lazio have, and it's been impressive to watch.
Definitely. And with Lazio drawing, that puts them into fifth spot. Same on points with Juventus, but Juventus have a better goal difference. So Lazio now in the next game face Venezia away, who are currently drawing 0-0 against Genoa as we record right now. But Lazio have quite some interesting fixtures, it's fair to say. They've got the Coppa Italia game against Inter before. They've also got an away game to Milan in the next few weeks, who are also just behind them as it currently stands. But Andrea, we're going to move on to the key topic that kind of got announced this evening, and that was Fabio Peccia. And let's talk about Parma. So Parma losing at home to Roma 1-0. A very much a rotated Roma, it's fair to say. We will give flowers to Claudio Ranieri. But first, let's talk about Fabio Peccia. I did speculate about Fabio Peccia's kind of future last week's episode, and obviously he has now been sacked. There have been rumours about David Balladini potentially being his replacement, but we've also got Igor Tudor, who I do like the sound of. I think he potentially could get the best out of this squad. But if you look at the records, Andrea, it's fair to say it only goes one way with Peccia. He likes attacking, but he doesn't like his defensive duties. So when you look at the stats, it's quite a telling story as to why Peccia has been eventually given a sack. So I don't know if this is the right thing, and I'll give you that question in a minute, but let's go through the stats. Obviously conceded 45 goals this season, second most behind Hellas Verona. They've also scored 30 goals, so second highest in that bottom half of the table. But when you're talking about the key stats that I think really got Peccia the sack, in terms of clean sheets, they are rock bottom of the rankings with only 2 clean sheets this season. Hellas, by the way, have got 4, and they've conceded far more greater goals. In terms of XG conceded, also the worst in this side with a rating of 44.9. But there's some disciplinary issues as well, it's fair to say, Andrea. They've had 5 red cards this season, joint second with Lecce. Tackles per game, they're 18th in the rankings, 8 per game on average, which, kind of goes to show you that whilst they have this expansive and attractive style of football, they couldn't get the basics right, really. And I think that's possibly the reason why Peccia's been given his marching orders. Now, obviously, we joked about Juric being assigned, but he's now out for the rest of the season. So whoever comes in is going to have to work with quite a limited squad. They're obviously outside of the window now, so they cannot bring anyone in. How do you see this? I mean, firstly, let's start off with Peccia. Do you think that was the right decision?
I think it was the right decision. When you look at, like you said, the goals conceded, I think as well, when you look at the last time they won a game was actually in December, late December, against Monza as well, which they just scraped as well. Again, Monza at the time were losing to everyone, so it wasn't that impressive. But when you look even now, if you look at the game now against Roma, like they ended up with 27% possession. in the whole game against a rotated
Mm.
Roma team, and you're home. It's just too much alarm bells. And I think what's kind of like ultimately been the final point is the fact that uh, even his style of play is kind of starting to fade away because I think you're absolutely right. I think you got to spot on with the whole idea of the basics. I think when you mess up those basics, you can't really play your style. Your kind of base to be able to play that elaborate style of football goes missing. And I think that's been the key. And you can't go into these games now with like limited possession, throwing away chances. And there's also the stability as well. I think Suzuki in goal has shown great moments, but again,
Yeah.
he's so eccentric, and and for a team that needs to stay up, it's a risk. He could do it
Mm.
to be he could help them, but there's a lot of question marks in certain areas. And again, you signed Juric, who didn't really suit the system. So I think there's a lot of question marks, but certainly for him, the biggest mistake of all was, like you said, the attacking sense of football rather than focusing on adapting defensively, perhaps in certain moments. And again, a big one is that Milan when you're 2-0 up, you should be winning that game, and you mess it up in the final moments. So again, so they've it's there's too many situations now where they've thrown it away, and they're getting beaten with ease. And I think that's
Mm.
the concern. I'm just surprised it hasn't happened earlier. I don't know what you think, but I just think
Yeah.
this has been telling for such a long time now. We've talked about this quite a few times on the pod in the last weeks or so. So I just think I don't know if you agree. I think if it was the right decision, but if it is the right decision, who do you think they should look at?
Yeah, it's an interesting scenario, isn't it? When you look at the grand scheme of things, I think nostalgically, or obviously maybe romantically as well, I love the style of football. But ultimately, as we've alluded to, you need to do the basics in this league. Sometimes you need to grind out results. They haven't done enough of that. And, when you look at the kind of squad itself, quite a talented squad, it's fair to say. This is almost the same group of players that got them up into Serie A, but obviously, I think there's been a few caveats, as you alluded to. Sion Suzuki, who has his moments, for example, Bone going off the boil, so to speak, for the second half of the season anyway. But even defensively, they're so rash in terms of the kind of defensive duties. Even in this game, for 60 minutes, they had to play with 10 men. And, Roma were very much a rotated side, as I alluded to. But in terms of someone that could come in, outside of the two that I have mentioned, I do like the sound of Igor Tudor. I think he will probably give a bit more discipline. He's been known for doing that at other clubs as well. But for me, if they've got the opportunity, someone like an Alberto Gilardino would be a great fit potentially as well. But I am personally struggling to think who realistically they could attract. I mean, we can all go off maybe thinking Massimo Allegri, for example. I think that's the kind of guy they actually need, is someone who's disciplinary, who will kind of get them to get points no matter what kind of style of football. And I'm sure the fan base wouldn't be against that, but I don't think a candidate of Allegri style is likely to join them. But I think if you got someone between, say, a Gilardino or Igor Tudor, that would be the great fit. When I saw the links to Balladini, I thought, what on earth is going here? They've gone for the cheap option. You might as well get David Nicola away from Calgary and bring him across. But yeah, is there anyone that springs to mind for you outside of the two that we've mentioned? I mean, Gilardino is probably a good one, right? That's available. That wouldn't require a lot of spend, but till the end of the season, do you think that could be an opportunity?
Yeah, I think Gilardino for me was the top quote I had. Ex-player as well. Again,
Mm,
he would have something to perhaps bring to the fans. Maybe he'll bring some sort of lift. I don't know. But certainly they need someone that's going to kind of come in and bring some sort of stability. And I think even though
yeah.
Gilardino did lose his job at Genoa, he did kind of bring that at Genoa. It just kind of faded out in the end. But again, it wasn't his fault. It was just because of the players that left and
Mm,
they weren't replaced. But again, it could be an option where it's likely safer in that sense of like experience of Serie A. The last thing they need is someone random that's got no experience to come in and take the job. They need someone that's got Serie A experience. So yeah, Gilardino for me would be the perfect one with the kind of ambition style he wants to play. Um, Perhaps getting points. A new manager bounce perhaps could potentially happen as well. So they've got
mm,
there's a few. I think those two are the main options. But if if they, I can't see anyone else other than those two being a good option,
Yeah,
realistic
no,
options, and I think
agree.
that's the key.
And I think we'll finally leave on this point here, Andrea. Parma's next few games are slightly favourable. I wouldn't say they're easy by any stretch of imagination, but the next game at home to Bologna before they face away to Udinese, then at home to Torino before they've got some potentially winnable games, but they are away from home. So that's away to Monza and away to Hellas Verona before they then face on the 6th of April at home to Inter. I mean, they need to make the appointment quite sharpish, don't they, if they want to get a bounce back effect, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think they've got to, if they've sacked him, they've got to have someone in mind already. But again, in Serie A, we don't know. It could be a last minute thing. But yeah,
Yeah.
they need someone urgently because, like you said, those games are winnable. And perhaps the reason why they did sack Pecky in this moment is because of that. Those run of games, perhaps get someone in that can get those points.
Well, before we leave this game, obviously we've got to give flowers to Roma, and in particular Claudio Ranieri. What a fantastic job he's doing! And as I alluded to, they did rotate the squad. They didn't have necessarily the kind of available players that they'd normally have. The likes of Dovbyk was demoted to the bench. We had the likes of Dybala, who's unfortunately picked up another injury. And unfortunately, it seems like a common theme with his career, unfortunately. But that said, fantastic goal from Matteo Sule. The Sule that we did see kind of break through at Frosinone, for example. Fantastic free kick. But we also saw slightly better performance from Shmorodov. It's fair to say he's not a favourite on the pod, apart from Rory. He loves Shmorodov, but my point is he actually linked up quite well with Sule. Sule took a lot of the pressure off the kind of general squad. But as you alluded to in last week's pod, Roma have got a favourable run of fixtures now. Do we kind of dream that maybe Roma break into the top five at the very minimum now?
Top five is, I think, it might be a slight push. Definitely into the sixth, seventh positions. 100%. I think they've got those fixtures to be up there. But yeah, I think with the run of fixtures, they've got a real good chance. And if they're able to rotate the team and get those results as well, there's a question of why not. A lot of teams have been dropping
Hmm.
points in and around those European places, so they've got an opportunity here. And again, they've gone under the radar, and I think they prefer that. They've been able just to focus on their game. It's been quiet, but when you realise, you like check the
Hmm.
table, like 2 months later, and you're like, oh wow,
Yeah,
they're actually in it. If they actually look at it. So yeah, I think they're definitely there, and they've got and I think Ranieri's doing a great job getting the best out of all the players, even those players that seem like surplus to requirements as well.
definitely. And before they kind of entertain Monza, which won't be until the following Monday, they face a home tie against Porto, which were unlucky in the previous round of the Europa League match where they drew 1-1. But they've also got Como at home before they entertain Empoli away the following Sunday as well. So some really winnable games, it's fair to say, and that could potentially, subject to the other results and the other teams, could help them to get at least into the top six there, Andrea. But let's move on. Obviously, we also have some other fixtures to allude to. I think I'm going to start off with Milan because I haven't got really much to say, and I think we can sum it up in about five, if we're lucky, maybe 3 minutes, I think. Key starting point. Let's talk about that fourth kit. What the hell was that? Do you actually like it? And I appreciate this has got the fundamentals of their previous kits in the 60s, as well as being themed around. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Martin Luther's "I Have a Dream" kind of sentiment, which I felt was a bit odd for Milan. I don't know what the dream is. Is Zlatan thinking a bit too hard there? But more importantly, that kit looks horrendous to me. So I'll get your thoughts in a moment. But Milan slightly better than the Empoli game, but again, they made it hard for themselves, right, in this match?
Yeah, I think definitely a little bit better, but not kind of similar pattern again, where they're not creating enough and they're leaving it to the last moment to win the game. They're kind of touring with the opposition to see if they can fight back and. But no, they've done enough. But I think again, Jimenez looks like a real player up top. They might have found their replacement. That they needed that up front. Morata didn't really fulfill it. and perhaps he's the guy. Again, tap in, but he was in the right place at the right time. I think Leao done really well for that assist as well.
Yeah.
He looked very sharp. Again, in moments though, not consistently, but
Yeah.
when he can do that, he can create those magical moments and win
Mm,
games. So there's a lot of positive in that sense, but I still think it still looks the same Milan team of like kind of grinding it through the game and trying to win it near the end. But they've just been fortunate they play teams that haven't punished them. So they've got away with it. But certainly for them, it's a big result again, and they got over the line and a clean sheet as well, which is
yeah.
come rare for
True.
Milan to be fair. So that's a good thing for them.
It was, however, Andrea, Hellas Verona. So what do you expect? If you're conceding to Hellas Verona, then there's going to be questions, right? But also I wanted to allude to the fact that João Felix had a good game. Rumours that, Milan are going to use this kind of loan deal to maybe exercise the opportunity to sign him as a future kind of product. 40 million euros is what they've been quoted for him potentially. Do we see this being good business, or do we think it's going to be the typical João Felix career pathway where it just is okay for a few games and then it dies?
I kind of go towards the latter, yeah, definitely. But it's quite interesting because I just think where would they get that money from to get that to prize them away anyway? That'd be the big question.
This is true.
But I'm enjoying the fact that he's doing well because Rory was saying he was going to do terrible to be the worst one, so it's quite funny in that sense. But I can't stay quiet because I said Zaniolo will be good, so we'll have to wait on that. But no, I think he's kind of a player they needed, really. Kind of that attacking player they've lacked in that kind of final third, that
Yeah.
playmaker kind of guy. So yeah, he's looked impressive, but again, it's still early on, so we'll have to wait and see. But certainly so far, he's been impressive.
Yeah, certainly. And just one quick one, you did allude to him, but Jimenez, I put in my notes, maybe the replacement for Giroud. Do you think long term, potentially, there's some vibes about him being a Giroud replacement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's got obviously more to his game as well. It's quite
Mm,
dynamic, quite got a bit of pace on him as well. He can dribble as well. He's quite direct with his dribbling, so I think he's got attributes to be quite a lot of attributes to be a really top striker in Serie A.
mm.
It's just again, obviously time, but also the players around him kind of, working as well. So it's still a bigger picture of Milan. Leao needing to still be consistent. Pulisic, coming on and, making a difference. So he's still going to need support, but certainly as a number 9, he looks like a real good option.
Well, Milan entertain Feyenoord in the return leg of the Champions League game tomorrow evening, or Tuesday evening if you're listening to us a different time. They are currently losing the first leg 1-0. Jimenez against his old club. Do we expect Jimenez to maybe fire Milan to the next round?
Yeah, why not? I think it'll be a good storyline. But yeah, I think they've got a good
Yeah.
chance.
Yeah, and thereafter they've got some potentially winnable games. I'm saying potentially because this is Milan anyway. So away to Torino on Saturday before they face midweek away to Bologna at 5:30 on the 26th. So interesting times for Milan. We won't allude too much on Hellas. I'm sure we will spend more time in the near future. But let's kind of dive our attentions to, I think let's give it a bit more flowers here. Udinese, not a team that we regularly talk about, but obviously we talked about how much maybe they were just lacking a bit of confidence against Napoli and could have maybe forced the issue. They won against Empoli 3-0. Not a spectacular game, it's fair to say, Andrea. One of my notes was Silvestri. I did not know he was in goal for Empoli. I must have missed that transfer. But he was capable or culpable for the first goal, should I say. But more of a composed performance, it's fair, for Udinese. I think they'll be safe in mid-table. Camp again, scoring 2 goals, so he's in incredible form. But one of the points I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth was Empoli. They seem like they're being dragged into it despite the transfer moves that they've done in the January transfer window. I don't think it was spectacular by any stretch of imagination, but as it currently stands in the table, when we're looking at it right now, they are only a point off Parma in 17th spot. The next game is against Atalanta, which just shows you it's not going to get any easier for Empoli. Do we feel that maybe Empoli are going to be dragged into this relegation battle now?
Yes, definitely. I think so. I think their kind of goals are dried up as well. Esposito, players like that haven't really continued their kind of form. It was a big ask to ask these players to keep continuing that form that they were showing at the start of the season. And
Mm,
obviously, of course, the main issue is they don't really have those options on the bench to make a difference either. But certainly, they've got some tough games. They've got to go to Napoli still.
yeah.
They've got to play Lazio. They've got to play Fiorentina. They've got to play quite a few of the top teams in the league. So
Mm,
around the league. So they've got and Roma as well. So they've got games where
yeah.
they could lose um, a lot of points. So certainly, when you start to see like this is the we always talk about it in football, but this is always the crucial points. Feb, March, April, where obviously that's where you start to see how your team mentally have it in the
Yeah.
league. If they've got the strength to carry on and get over the line, and it just at the moment seems like Empoli are fading, and it's a bit worrying at the moment for them. But it looks like they started to kind of hit a slump.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely they warrant where they are at the moment with the performances they've done.
Definitely. Definitely. Anyway, let's kind of move on. I'm conscious of time. So, your beloved Fiorentina at home to Como. Como, fantastic goals, but what happened? Fiorentina, is this the kind of Jekyll and Hyde side of Fiorentina that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's the worrying thing of all is that I think we alluded to it in the previous game of the previous games we were just talking about is that Fiorentina again showed where they don't really have that. It's like they didn't want to win the game. They were slow to everything, second to every ball. No one kind of stepping up and trying to win the game for you. The press was awful. Like Como had the ball in the halfway line, no one challenging. And Como, all they did was press the defense, and Fiorentina made mistakes, and they were able to score. And again, I just think sometimes, as we were saying, the basics of football can really do wonders. And I
Mm,
think the worrying thing is that Fiorentina, when every game they've played, and I've called this recently as well, is that even when they've won the games, they've not looked convincing. And I think it goes to the players. I think as much as the manager, I question his selection stuff. I think the players got to have a hard look at themselves that they're playing at home against Como, who are decent, but they should be winning these games. They should be taking ownership. But in the end, they look like the away team, and they look like a team in the relegation zone. That's how bad it was.
mm,
But on Colemore's side, I've got to say, fantastic performance. I think Fabregas spot on with the tactics. I think tactically outsmarted Palladino, knew the
mm,
weaknesses that Fiorentina had, i.e., playing from the back, they can't play out when you press them. The whole 90 minutes, Como pressed Fiorentina defense the whole time. I think it was impressive to see because it's risky at the same time. You can get played out and then but every time they did that, they stopped Fiorentina from doing anything. And I think that's got to be credited to Fabregas and also the Como players to be able to do that,
mm.
sustain it, and be impactful in it.
Yeah, and certainly that Nico Pass goal was one to rewatch because what a hit it was. Are you impressed by Nico Pass? Because obviously at the beginning of the season there wasn't much known about him, but his credentials have really kind of started to flourish a lot more recently. And there's obviously these links with Inter, but I'm sure there'll be more clubs interested in his services come the summer. But are you pleasantly maybe surprised at the way that he's developed under Cesc Fabregas?
It's I think yes and no though. I think at the start we kind of saw those signs, but I think now what we're starting to see is that he's elevated his games in terms of shooting for himself, scoring goals, and actually creating a bit more clear-cut chances in the final
Mm,
third. But certainly for his sake, I think he's been very impressive. I would really like him to see him stay at Como for another year, but
mm,
chances are he'll end up at a big team. But I just think he's got that free roam to kind of get the ball and do what he wants with it basically. And I think he likes that, and obviously be able to express himself. And I think what I like about him the most is that he's got no fear when he gets the ball. He always wants the ball and he always wants
mm.
to create. And I think
Yeah.
that's testament to what he's been doing and how good of a player he is. So he's a fascinating player to watch, and I think he's got so much growth potential in the future in the game.
Well, with that result, that puts Como into 13th spot on 25 points, same level with Calgary, but with a better goal difference. And as it currently stands, above them is Genoa, who are currently still drawing 0-0 against Venezia. So that could be a potentially good point for Venezia, as that brings them a little bit closer to Parma as we currently stand. But for Fiorentina, Andrea, it's interesting. I'm just looking at your results, and it feels like you've got maybe the next few games that might give you a potential kickstart, but then you've got some really tough games coming up as well. Because if we look at the kind of next few games, Hellas Verona away, then at home to Lecce before you then go away to Napoli, then at home to Juventus, then at home to Atalanta before then you've got an away tie against Milan. So it doesn't get any easier for Palladino or Fiorentina. Do they need to make maximum points of the next two games?
Yeah, it's paramount they do that. I personally think this results cost them the chance of the fifth and fourth. Like I don't want to be dramatic, but I really feel like when you look at the
Mm.
grand scheme of things, I think that they've kind of they've gone out of it. I think they're going to miss out on that fifth and fourth. I think Lazio and Juventus might have the momentum now to push and get that position. I think Lazio have just been consistent, whereas Fiorentina, like you said, they win two and they lose two, and it's just a similar pattern over again. So I just think, yeah, it's a big blow. But at the same time, yeah, they've got to win those two games, and then those four games in a row, those hard games, they could end up with not even 3 or 6 points out of 12. So yeah, it looks like it's most probably going to pan out. The season's going to probably go in a bit of a slump.
Certainly will be. And finally, Andrea, we will be alluding to one of your rivals, Bologna, who secured a 3-2 victory over Torino. I will not say I told you so with Casadei's debut, giving away a penalty against Pobega, giving Bologna the opportunity to equalise. But everyone has to watch this, but Baragi's own goal that gave the winner to Bologna is comical. It's fair to say. I don't know how to describe it, Andrea. He kind of tries to clear it right, but it bounces off in the wrong direction. Is that how you describe it, or I don't know how you describe that own goal?
Yeah, I think that's the only way to say it. He's tried to clear it, but hasn't cleared it, but cleared it. Um, but again, he's meant to be helping us, but he's helping them. I don't understand. It seemed a bit sus. They should look into that because it was not normal how he's done that.
I don't know how he's managed to do it, but we have to do special mentions for Dan Ndoye. What a performance from him as well. Fantastic few goals that he scored. One from the penalty spot, as I alluded to, from Casadei making that mistake. But the first one through the middle, dispatched quite emphatically. But what I was most impressed with was Elfi Elmas's goal for Torino. What a goal that was. A return to Serie A from his exploits at Leipzig, and he looks at home, Andrea. I'd love to see the most out of Elmas because I think he was a very underrated player at Napoli. He's one of those that I think can still do a hell of a job for one of the teams, even if it's not Torino potentially. But yeah, certainly seems to be getting off to a good start currently for Torino, it's fair to say. I'm just going to quickly allude to the other fixture. I think it's just fixture rather than fixtures because we haven't alluded to Monza and Lecce. They drew 0-0. Alessandro Nesta getting a solitary point, which is, I suppose, good news for Monza, but writings on the wall for Monza, right? I think despite this, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference, right? Because they got Roma next.
No, and I think I just know I feel like the rehiring of Nesta was just them accepting we're probably going to go down, and we need someone to stick it out and then try and rebuild the Serie B. I think that's what it kind of felt like in the end. But certainly they've gone all over the place. And Maldini being sold, I think that's the big turning point. I think the only one player where you could be like, you know what, a bit of magic, he gets you a goal, could win you a game. They don't have that either. So yeah, I don't think it looks good for them.
Definitely doesn't. Anyway, there are a few European games this week, but I'm going to just quickly summarize round 26 games, which take place on Friday the 21st. So, first round of games is Lecce at home to Udinese. That's a 7:45 p.m. kickoff time in the UK. Before we then move into Saturday's fixtures, so starting off with Parma at home to Bologna at 2 p.m. We've also got Venezia at home to Lazio at the same time. Before at 5 p.m. we've got Torino at home to Milan, and then 7:45 we've got Inter at home to Genoa. Then we move into Sunday's games at 11:30 a.m. We've got Como at home to Napoli. Before at 2 p.m. we've got Hellas Verona at home to your beloved Fiorentina, Andrea, and then at 5 p.m. we've got Empoli at home to Atalanta. Before 7:45. I don't think I'll be tuning into it, but I suspect I'll have to watch it. It's Calgary at home to Juventus. Before on Monday evening, we've got 7:45 p.m. kickoff time, Roma at home to Monza. So I don't think there's many amazing highlights to be kind of alluded to from that game week, but you never know, listener and viewers. It has a habit of surprising us, and that's why we love Calcio. Andrea, we've done it. We've come up to the hour mark. More importantly, where can people check out your fine, good stuff?
Yeah, they can check out TikTok, YouTube, Instagram at Calciofiore with the handle.
Fantastic. Yes, with the handle Calciofiore, right? In very
Yeah,
different places, right? But
yeah,
more importantly, also, you can check out the Anglo-Italian podcast on most of the socials. It is at Anglo-Italian Pod, with the exception of Twitter, which is Italian Anglo Pod. And I got that right, Roy. I got that one right. But more importantly, if you could do us a favor, make sure if you're on your podcasting app of choice, you just write a review or give us a rating. That'd be really appreciated because we need to balance it out, in particular on the Apple variant. But for now, for another week of Calcio, we bid you farewell and say ciao, ciao, and we'll see you next week.
ciao, ciao.